for International Political Economy and our second event on EU-Mercosur trade relations dedicated to environmental protection and more specifically, the role of trade policy in tackling deforestation. My name is Emily Rees and I'm a senior fellow here at ECIPE and lead for the EU-Mercosur project that includes a series of events, economic research, articles, and much more. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter to keep appraised of all our initiatives. Now, the recent spike in deforestation rates in the Amazon is alerting. Europeans are calling on governments to prioritize climate and environmental considerations, and there's a growing feeling that the trade deal with Mercosur might run against the priorities of the European Green Deal. Amongst the many concerns is that of deforestation and the forest fires in the Brazilian Amazon, and the fact that they could cancel out the climate change mitigation efforts that are being made in Europe. The Trade and Sustainable Development chapter of the EU-Mercosur agreement does set out provisions on deforestation, but do they have sufficient teeth to make a difference? Well, to tackle this very thorny interaction between deforestation and trade, I am delighted to host some exceptional guests today. Before I introduce each of them, allow me to clarify some important concepts to get the most out of today's session. The Amazon rainforest is a tropical forest that covers most of the Amazon basin of South America. So far, so good. The basin covers a territory belonging to 9 countries and over 3,000 indigenous territories. 60% of the Amazon rainforest is found in Brazil, followed by Peru and Colombia. And when we consider French Guiana, part of the Amazon is in the European Union. Now, when we dive into Brazilian administrative divisions, you'll find what we call the legal Amazon. That's a territory that includes 9 Brazilian states. And although we call this region the legal Amazon, it actually overlaps 3 different biomes. All of Brazil's Amazon biome, 37% of the Cerrado biome, and 40% of the Pantanal biome. Now, keep this part in mind, because when we're going to hear from our speakers, particularly from Mato Grosso, they come from a state where there are all 3 natural biomes within that one state. Now, today, our speakers will be zooming in on the deforestation of 2 states of Brazil, Pará and Mato Grosso. And according to the Brazilian Space Agency, INPE, whose data is generally considered most accurate, these 2 states combined over 60% of accumulated deforestation in Brazil last year, with the state of Pará considered worst offender with 44% of national deforestation. Now, to debate why and what can be done, I'm honored to introduce you to a lineup of exceptional speakers today. First, a big welcome to Jana Tytievskaya, that many of you in Brussels will know, a distinguished international trade policy analyst at the European Parliament's Research Service, which is the Parliament's in-house think tank. Jana is the institution's in-house expert on trade and sustainable development chapters of EU trade deals, and she's here representing her own expert views. Jana has worked with DG Trade and the European Economic and Social Committee, specializing in trade relations with Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey, and is known for her work on trade policy reform. We'll be hearing more from Jana a bit later when we discuss deforestation in the context of the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter of the trade deal and its enforceability. Now, joining us from Sweden, we have Dr. Toby Gartner, who's joining us from the Stockholm Environmental Institute, where he is a senior research fellow and director of TRACE, the Transparency for Sustainable Economies initiative. For the past 20 years, Toby has been working on the challenge facing the sustainable development of tropical landscapes. And for those that don't know TRACE, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about today, it is a science-based supply chain transparency initiative, which is widely recognized as groundbreaking in its analysis of international trade, with a focus on agricultural commodities linked to deforestation. Toby has also helped found the Sustainable Amazon Network in the state of Pará, and has authored more than 120 peer-reviewed publications. He was awarded the British Ecological Society's prize for his contribution to the science of ecology. Welcome, Toby. Now, in Minas Gerais, joining us today, Dr. Raoni Rajão. You are also an expert in the state of Pará and an esteemed member of the Brazilian Academy of Science. Raoni is an associate professor in environmental management and social studies at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And your research spans across spatially explicit modeling, you'll have to explain to us what that means, ecological economics, political ecology, and science policy interface. You've collaborated with numerous agencies, including the UN, the World Bank, the German Technical Cooperation Agency, GIS, and launched together with the government of the state of Pará and the Federal Public Attorney's Office an open platform called Selo Verde, or Green Stamp, which we look forward to hearing a lot more about today. Fernando, turning to you, you are the director of the state of Mato Grosso's Produce, Conserve, Include program that was launched in the wake of COP21 and the Paris Climate Accord. It's a multi-stakeholder platform that basically aims, amongst many other goals, you'll tell us a bit more about that, to recover degraded pastures in Mato Grosso, increase agricultural productivity, whilst also protecting 60% of the state's native vegetation and eliminating illegal deforestation. Fernando is an agronomical engineer by training, and you specialized in meat and dairy production in France's National Agricultural School in Angers. Before this, Fernando was the president of the Sustainable Livestock Roundtable and the executive director of the Brazilian Beef Exporters Association. So welcome to you, Fernando. And then last but not least, also from Mato Grosso, we have, it's a pleasure to have Ricardo Arioli, who's also an agronomist and a farmer based in Campo Novo, and one of the founders of the Brazilian Soybean Farmers Association. Ricardo, you farm with your brother around 2,000 hectares of soybeans, 1,000 hectares of corn, and keep around 3,000 head of beef cattle, if I'm not misunderstood. And since last year, you were named president of the National Commission for Cereals, Fibers, and Oilseeds at the Brazilian Confederation of Agriculture. Ricardo, you're well known to be a voice in favor of sustainable soy production, and we look forward to understanding more about what that means in practice. But a less known feature is that you also have a radio talk show in which you broadcast across 28 radio stations in the state of Mato Grosso. So an influential voice here today. Today, we'll also be welcoming Anna Cavazzini from the European Parliament. As many of you know, the European Parliament is in plenary session right now, so Anna will be joining us throughout our event. She is one of the most vocal voices on deforestation out there and human rights in Brazil. She's a German politician from the Greens Group, chair of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee, and she's also vice chair of the Delegation for Relations with Brazil. Before her election to the European Parliament in 2019, she worked as an expert on the Sustainable Development Goals at the German Federal Foreign Office, where she was seconded to the UN General Assembly, and has also worked as an advisor on trade policy at the development NGO Compact. If you would like to ask any of our questions to any of our speakers, please pop in your questions into the chat function today, and I'll make sure to get as many of them answered as possible. So let's get straight into the core of the subject. Literature today has suggested that there are three main aggregate causes for deforestation worldwide. And that is agricultural expansion, wood extraction, and the expansion of infrastructure. And when I was preparing for this debate, I sought to find more scientific data on the drivers of deforestation in Brazil. And I must admit, I really found it very difficult to find two sources of information that crossed. So if you'll allow me, I'd like to kick off this debate turning to our two academics, that is Toby and Raoni, to answer this very simple question, which seems so simple, but apparently isn't that simple. What are the key drivers of deforestation in Brazil today? Shall we start with Raoni?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I believe one of the quick questions or key aspects to answer this question is the temporal issue. Because on the short term, if you look right now, at the beginning of deforestation, you have logging, you have sometimes mining, and then when it becomes clear cut, you have actually a process which is more linked to land grabbing and land speculation than agricultural production per se. So the regions that right now produce are quite different from the regions where deforestation are taking place for the most case. However, over time, the regions that are right now the frontier of new deforestation, of land grabbing, are going to be, most probably in 10 years, key places of that going to produce actually also have a high level of agricultural production. So that's why it makes it so hard to pinpoint a single issue without taking into consideration the linear part. But the truth is, at the end of the day, you have this whole series of different supply chains, from timber to illegal gold to illegal land, and then agricultural production that go in section. And each one of those sectors has its own share of blame of the issue of deforestation as we see it.
Toby, is that also your view that perhaps the land grabbing aspect has been not only under considered, let's say when we look at it from a European perspective, but also what it could mean in the future?
Yeah, no, very nicely put by Raoni. I mean, I think that it's important to keep in mind a few aspects. When we look at the deforested land across Brazil, and especially in the Amazon, one thing that anyone who's been there is struck by is that a hell of a lot of it is not under productive use. So in the future, it may well become under productive use, but the most common site you can see in Brazilian Amazon in a cleared area is essentially an empty and poorly managed cattle pasture, which of course is not really producing cattle. So that's driven partly by speculation, but it's also driven by the fact that land tenure is often unclear, that the fact that the repercussion for clearing is often quite small. So why not? There is an opportunity to clear and see what can be made of it. And one of the indicators that demonstrates that is the fact that a sizable chunk of land that's cleared across the Amazon, especially in states like Pará, is returned to second growth forest. It's abandoned quite quickly. So it was cleared with no strategic, rational, economic plan in mind. And it was then retired, and now we have secondary forest, which of course are a shadow of the primary forests that they've replaced. And if we look on so that's like the deeper picture. If we look at the face of it, you can quickly say that the vast majority of land that's cleared, the first few years after it's been cleared, is in some form of cattle pasture. But because of these complex dynamics, it isn't only the demand for beef and other cattle products, of course, that's behind that. And the final thing I'll say is that we have a complex set of indirect land use changes that we need to remember. So there is evidence to suggest that in some places, the expansion of soy has the coupling of soy and deforestation has certainly been weakened, because what we see now is expansion of soy mostly onto some of this low productivity or abandoned cattle pasture. And that is absolutely the case in the Amazon. However, what we also see is a continued increase in deforestation with an expansion of new areas into the forest. And over time, as Raoni has said, these new areas are in turn replaced, some of them, by soy. So it's quite hard to imagine that the expansion of soy onto pasture is not somehow linked to the expansion of pasture onto forest. So there's a domino effect there, which requires us to keep the interaction between commodities, the interactions between land use, and the more complex underlying speculative dynamics linked to land tenure, linked to repercussion of opening the land in mind when we're looking at the full set of drivers.
So when we're looking at this land clearing that you are both describing, who is doing this? Is it driven by poverty? Is it driven by speculation? You also mentioned this complex indirect land use change. Perhaps you could touch upon that. Maybe coming back to you, Toby, very quickly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so it certainly isn't mostly driven by poverty. There are pockets of extreme poverty, of course, across Brazil. And you can see in localized areas, in assentamentos, in the agrarian reform settlements, that deforestation can be high there. But if you look at the absolute numbers, the vast majority is still cleared in areas, properties, large properties. And by Brazilian standards, a large property is more than 2,000 hectares. And deforestation is often highly concentrated in those properties. So we did a piece of work in the Trace Initiative in collaboration with our partners in Imaflora and ECIPE in Brazil, focused on the state of Mato Grosso, and it was looking at the case of illegal deforestation for soy. And what we found was the vast majority of deforestation, illegal deforestation for soy, was in just 2% of the properties, 400 properties. So that's a really powerful insight, actually, because it demonstrates, okay, the problem is a sizable one, but most of it is in a handful of a very small number of places and in the hands of a very small number of actors. Who aren't, needless to say, the poor ones. But the indirect land use change dynamic is, what I tried to explain earlier. What we're seeing at the moment is an increase in deforestation. Let's look at the Amazon, increase in deforestation in the Amazon. And that is not being driven in the first instance by farmers themselves. It's being opened up by people who are ahead of that wave, speculators, some cattle pastures. And over time, that may well turn into cropland. But what we're seeing is an increase of deforestation. We're also seeing an increase in the area of large mechanized agriculture, of soy in particular, but we're not seeing a net increase, by and large, in pasture area. So if deforestation is going up, but the area of pasture is not going up commensurate with deforestation, but mechanized agriculture is going up, then it suggests that the area of pasture is somehow being displaced or pushed by the expansion of agriculture into the forest area, with the important caveat, as we're discussing, that a lot of this land is not under productive use. It is not being driven purely and simply by a demand for cattle products, for beef or for leather.
Raoni,
would you concur with what's just being said?
Yeah, I would like just to add, an economic reading to this. To the forest, large chunk is big business. It's expensive. You need to clear an area as big as a football field with a hectare. You need about 1,000 reais. That's around 200 euros, and that's not something a poor farmer has. A poor farmer has usually only its own work. It's on the work of himself and his family, and for him to clear 6 football fields or more per year, it's a lot of effort. Which means that you need actually to pay someone to put machinery in to bring, a personnel which actually, paid for in order to make this work. And if you look at the trend of deforestation in Brazil in the last 20 years, the amount of deforestation under 25 hectares has been actually more or less the same over time, which is pretty much this poverty-related deforestation, especially the small one under 6 hectares, which never has been higher than 5% of the total deforestation. What we have seen in the last 2 years, especially, which is very worrisome, are the large chunks of deforestation of 100 hectares or more. We're talking about people investing at least 20,000 euros to clear a piece of land, putting their money there, capital investment, to then try to cash in that investment by selling the land later on. And so that's basically, it's very important also to have this very separated. And as Toby highlighted, we also we did a study published last year in Science called The Rotten Apples of Brazil's Agribusiness. And it's called Rotten Apples because what we found, to our surprise, that 62% of all the illegal deforestation in both Cerrado and the Amazon, which encompasses most of Brazil, is concentrated in actually also 2% of all farms, of medium and large farms. So you don't need to end up finding everybody and actually prosecuting everybody. If you are organized enough and go after those rotten apples, it's really possible to reduce deforestation substantially. And those are basically well-financed, well-capitalized land speculators.
So if we take this concept of rotten apples and turning to you, Ricardo, I mean, we've had several mentions here to soy production, and you're a soy farmer in Mato Grosso as being one of the key drivers, or one of the drivers, let's say, even if it's an indirect driver. We also heard that in Mato Grosso, we're probably talking about deforestation that's coming from 400 properties, or 2% of the properties. I mean, clearly as a farmer that's been engaged in driving sustainable practices in the state, how do you explain these dynamics, and what can be done then to weed out these rogue players?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here representing the farmers of Mato Grosso state. I'm a farmer since '87 here in Mato Grosso, in Campo Novo do Parecis. We are far away from the Amazon, but we are in the Cerrado, so we have some issues about that also. Number one, in my opinion, it's proved by the soy moratorium that soybeans is not a driver of the deforestation. The soybeans in Mato Grosso is the most watched crop in the world, with satellites and visits and everything. And I really don't know why in the last 20 years, as a farmer, this illegal deforestation affects our image. We really would like to see this ending in Brazil. But in the last 20 years, the governments, the police, the command and control didn't succeed to do that. Yeah, I don't know why they should. Yeah, but as a farmer, what can I do? When I hear that deforestation in the Amazon rainforest is increasing, what should I do? Go there and try to find who's doing that? That's not my role in this case. Our role as farmers in the last 15 years were, we have a new environmental law, very new, and it's you have to keep a part of your farm as a legal reserve. In my case, it's 20%, as the law was when we transformed our farm into production area 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And in the Amazon, it's 80% a legal reserve. That's private. It's money of my family that is enrolled there to keep this 20% inside our farm that is linked to the environmental conservation. And besides that, we have the cadastro, the National Rural Cadastro, that every farmer must show for everybody, because the cadastro is open, where your farm is, where is your legal reserve, with satellite images of high resolution, so everybody can check what is going on. Nowadays, if you don't have a cadastro, you cannot sell your soybeans for any trading. So it's very difficult. It's impossible to be an illegal soybean farmer here in Brazil nowadays, because it's all open. The information is open. When I sit in front of a bank manager to ask for some financing, he probably knows more about my farm and about myself than I do, because sometimes the trading companies and the banks, they buy the information. There are companies that sell information about farming here in Mato Grosso, and so it's all open. That's what we did. We enrolled very fast on the cadastro. We have more than 7 million farms enrolled in the cadastro, so we are all open for these discussions, okay? But from a farmer perspective, I would like to see the deforestation ending, but it's not my role to go there and arrest anybody. I'm doing what I can do as a farmer.
Thank you, Ricardo, and welcome, Anna, to the debate. You're arriving at a key moment when we're talking about the drivers of deforestation. Just on that point, Ricardo, if I may, before we turn to Fernando, so you mentioned the cadastral. So this is the rural registry, right? And it's linked to the commercial banking system with the satellite system. Is this a mandatory system for all farmers? How does that work? If you could just give in a nutshell before we turn to Fernando.
Yeah, it's mandatory for all farms, mandatory. You have to enroll at the cadastro if you want to sell any production from your farm, or if you want to take any money from a bank to finance your operation. Yeah, it's a prerequisite for a Brazilian farmer. The first thing that a trading company asks when I go there, they don't ask what price do you want for your soybeans, or do you have soybeans for sale, or do you have cattle for sale. The first question is, I want to see your cadastro. Do you have a cadastro? Do you have an environmental protected area inside your farm? Then we can do business. That's the deal here in Brazil.
Thank you very much. Fernando, okay, so you're with the state of Mato Grosso, and as we heard earlier, following the latest numbers from INEP, the state of Mato Grosso has been singled out with some of the highest deforestation rates in 2020, and the figures for 2021 aren't looking great. Explain to us, I mean, what are the dynamics in the state of Mato Grosso, and what are public authorities doing to fight this situation?
Hi, Emily. Well, thanks for having me here. And I think I agree with what Raoni and Toby presented. I mean, we know how deforestation is happening today in Mato Grosso on these frontier areas. So you have this combination of logging, mining, land grabbing, and somehow this land will turn into production. But I would say, as answering your first question, that the main driver of deforestation is the absence of state on these frontier regions, because all these are illegal criminal activities that are happening, and that's what the state of Mato Grosso is taking, serious step to tackle the illegality on those regions. Of course, if you look at absolute numbers, the deforestation in Mato Grosso will always be big because it's a very big state. To have an idea for the people that's watching, Mato Grosso state in Brazil is about the size of France and Germany put together. And we still have more than 60% of the state territory still has native vegetation. And we are the biggest producers of soy, beef, cotton, and other agricultural commodities in Brazil. So from one hand, what Mato Grosso is doing to tackle illegality on these regions is we have, first of all, improved the capacity of the state to control deforestation. So the governor has put the control of deforestation on the top of his political agenda. The policies that were conducted only by the environmental secretariat in the state are now conducted by a committee that puts together the environmental secretariat, but also the security forces, the public prosecutors, and other agencies that can work on deforestation. There's a strategic plan with targets to reduce deforestation, and there is an annual action plan that's put in motion every year with actions focused on controlling deforestation. So last year, the state invested more than 30 million reais on this plan, and this year we are investing 73 million reais on the control of deforestation and forest fires. So there is a plan, there is investment, there is political will, and we are using technology to improve the capacity of detecting deforestation. So we are working now with a rapid alert system. So the public agencies, they have real-time information on deforestation, so they can act fast. They can cross this information with the rural environmental register that Ricardo was talking about, to identify the people responsible for that. And the deforestation that is happening on public land, to deploy forces to the ground, confiscate machinery. So this is actually happening in Mato Grosso. And if you look at the deforestation alerts from INPE, you're going to see that we are succeeding in keeping deforestation lower than last year level. So we are definitely expecting better results this year, considering everything that is being done. We recently had the visit of the European Union ambassador in Cuiabá, the German ambassador, the United Kingdom ambassador, and the United States ambassador. They came here to see what Mato Grosso is doing. And I know that we presented all of those actions. So this is the side of command and control, to tackle illegality and tackle deforestation. But on the other hand, what we are putting together with the PCI initiative, Produce, Conserve, Include, is how we can bring other actors to support this agenda. Because the government will not solve everything alone. We have to put together civil society, the producers, and the private companies to help these efforts. So the PCI is about creating this multi-stakeholder effort, on this agenda. We believe that we can achieve social and economic development in Mato Grosso through land use efficiency. So that means that we can produce more, intensifying cattle production, expanding crop area over pasture areas. For you to have an idea, the market is saying that in the next 10 years, Brazil will need 10 million hectares more of soy for domestic demand, export demand. Mato Grosso alone has 14 million hectares of pasture that could be transformed in agriculture. So all the future demand for soy from Brazil can fit inside Mato Grosso pastures alone. And we still have pastures and we can still produce more beef. So producing more, controlling deforestation, keeping the environmental assets that we have, and including the smallholders and indigenous people on this process of development. That's what the PCI is all about. And we want to put, the efforts of the private sector to help what we are trying to achieve.
Thank you, Fernando. I mean, here, when you're talking about intensifying cattle production, I've already got a couple of comments coming in about animal welfare, but we'll take that on another event. So, I mean, we've looked here at some of the key drivers of deforestation. We're seeing that it's slightly more complex in terms of the dynamics, the direct and the indirect land use change that is happening, and also the differences that are occurring from one state to another. What I'd like to do now is maybe if we can explore how international trade can act as a driver, let's say, of embedded deforestation. Is that something that's actually happening or not? We've heard different views on that. I mean, the EU is still considered as the second largest importer of embedded deforestation after China worldwide. Meaning that its imports produce negative externalities in terms of environment, and that can be in terms of degradation, environmental degradation, but also the greenhouse gas emissions in the country of origin. So one of the things that the EU is looking at in terms of its due diligence requirements is to really curtail this embedded deforestation in the products that are imported into Europe. So in that regard, very much a demand-led, let's say, approach. And one of the ways that the EU is looking at this is a supply chain traceability that is based on sort of a no-harm approach to the environment. And in that regard, we're seeing a number of new tools and data emerge, but nothing that has now, let's say, grasped our attention as being one of a solution that can really be implemented practically today. However, there are many great instruments out there, and particularly the ones that are put into place to monitor land use change. and trace global commodity trade flows. And I'm really happy that we have Toby today, because since I discovered the Trace platform, and for those of you that haven't gone onto this, it's Trace with an S.earth. I really encourage everyone to go and take a look at that platform. I mean, I've been fascinated to the extent to which you've been able to map deforestation risk of products in unprecedented detail. It's not countrywide or commodity-wide yet. Maybe you can give us some updates on what the platform can do next. But it really has been very useful in terms of using localized data to look at sourcing patterns and crossing that with deforestation activity. So first, could you explain to us what is Trace? How does it function in practice? And in your view, what stands in the way of a more comprehensive use of platforms and instruments such as Trace at an international level?
Thanks very much, Emily. You did my job for me in presenting it so nicely there. What Trace tries to do, first of all, Trace, as you said at the beginning, is a science-based data and research initiative that tries to provide an independent and credible source of data and analysis to better understand global trade patterns and embedded risks linked to deforestation, but not deforestation only. And what Trace tries to do is respond to a yawning gap that we have in data availability for understanding trade. On the one hand, we've historically relied very much on very crude bilateral trade flows. Is something coming from Brazil, in which case maybe it's coming from the Amazon, in which case, and that's often enough of a trail of ifs. And that's embedded into footprint calculators and life cycle analyses. Very, very crude. We know, as we've just been hearing, including from Ricardo, that there is immense heterogeneity, the vast majority of producers not linked to deforestation. So it's imperative that you can discriminate good practices from bad practices. And to do that, you need to be able to have subnational resolution in your supply chain mapping. Now, there are, of course, many examples of where particular supply chains, particular companies have mapped certain supply chains in great detail. But what that does is it just separates a particular supply line from the context of the sector. Because ultimately, we don't care, or we shouldn't care, how well performing France is, for example, or Unilever or Tesco, in terms of the extent to which their supply chain is linked to embedded deforestation and emissions. We should care about the net effect. If we're talking from demand side measure perspective, we should care about the net effect of these impacts on outcomes on the ground. And Trace tries to fill that by mapping the central part of the supply chain. So we map from regions, in the case of Brazil, municipalities of which there are more than 2,000 that produce soy, for example, for export, right through to countries where it's imported, and identifying the companies along the way. We do that by bringing together lots of different data sets. It's a jurisdictional approach. We're not able to resolve the supply down to an individual farm. That is not possible at scale, and is unlikely to ever be possible given the nature of commodities like soy, which is crushed and milled and processed at various stages along the supply chain. Segregating and vertically integrating an entire supply chain down to the farm is not a practical, realistic proposition. But we provide essentially a risk screening tool that says, well, where is most of the impact associated? Where is it concentrated? Which is an entry point for change. So we bring together different data sets and provide what we consider the best available estimate of the most plausible sourcing regions of a given buyer. And then what we do is we cross, as you said, we cross detailed deforestation data with detailed commodity expansion maps to provide an estimate of the amount of so if there is 1,000 hectares of deforestation in a given municipality and there's 500 hectares of soy expansion occurred on those recently deforested land, and you've got 500 hectares of deforestation linked to soy. And if you've got, let's say, 2 buyers, and one of those buyers is associated with 90% or 80% of that of the supply coming out of that municipality, we associate the portion of 80%, so 400 hectares out of the 500 of deforestation, to that buyer. That's the risk that they are exposed to deforestation and associated impacts in that sourcing region. So hopefully that was clear. I mean, that is the data product that Trace provides. It links expansion of commodities onto deforestation, assigns it to commodity flows based on the relative market share of buyers from that region. And what that does is it provides, very simply, an entry point. It simplifies the complexity. Europe as a whole is buying soy from approaching 2,000 municipalities. But if you ask of the data, as you can do very simply with Trace, where is 50% of that supply coming from? It's about 50 places. If you ask where is 50% of the deforestation coming from, it's about 15 places. So you very quickly have a manageable, tangible picture. And that removes the often stupefying or paralyzing effect that the complexity has, or often an excuse for inaction that it can also bring. And you ask at the end, what is the main barrier to the uptake of information like this and others, which of course in our data can be coupled with other more detailed systems, like the one that Haoni has been involved in developing with Stella Vergi in Pará, which does go down to farm level. There are many barriers. I mean, one of them, though, is consistent, harmonized asks of what import countries are expecting. So what are the measures that are going to be used to judge that due diligence has been applied to acceptable standard? What are the measures that are going to be used to judge whether progress is on track? We can't have multiple versions of the truth, and we can't have multiple competing demands and requirements on the private sector. We have to align what those expectations are. So the due diligence legislation and the chapter in the Mercosur agreement, there is a real need to bring some coherence to what is expected of producer countries and what is expected of the private sector. And if we can start to do that, then we can also have a clear expectation of what companies should be disclosing in order to improve their own transparency. Because from the perspective of the work that we do, the more transparent the good actors are about their own practices, the better we can map their own supply chain and more accurately apportion the impacts to the other actors who can be identified as being more responsible.
So what I'm hearing here, Toby, is basically Ricardo, who's got his hectares of soy, should be able to export as a good player discriminately from, let's say, those that are not working within the legal premises of environmental protection in Brazil. And I'll give you a hand there, Ricardo, in just one second. But I'd like to turn to Anna, because what we're looking at is we have these platforms, we've got these instruments, we have ways of looking at discriminating between these producers, the ones that are, as Haoni has mentioned, the rotten apples, the 2%, and the ones that are really supplying in a correct manner. As a policymaker, what do you think we can do to better integrate these instruments into our policies at a European level to curtail the embedded deforestation that we're talking about?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, and sorry that I'm coming late, but I was coming from other parliamentary meetings. We have plenary week at the moment in the European Parliament. Yeah, Emily, you mentioned already at the beginning a very important piece of legislation that is underway in the European Union, because I think, yeah, the idea that the European Union, of course, with its consumption and its imports is contributing to worldwide deforestation finally arrived in Brussels after some years of environmental NGOs and also us Greens pointing to that problem. So we are expecting in September, I hope, or latest October, I don't know exactly the timetable of the Commission at the moment, a legislation on deforestation-free supply chains. And of course, in these kind of legislations, it's absolutely important to have proper monitoring tools, because the idea would be that all the forest risk commodities imported into the European Union are free from deforestation. And of course, you need to make sure that it's really the case and that there's no fraud or no whatever. So I think basically projects like Trace not only help analyzing and influencing the public debate, but probably will also help very concretely when we try to bring into force this very important piece of legislation, because there is different estimations, estimates, probably you mentioned it already, but yeah, the EU is, I think it depends, but I think researchers say 20% of global deforestation is also driven by EU imports. So we have absolutely a responsibility in that.
Thank you. Anna, I'll come back to you in a second, because I do want to give the word now to Ricardo, who is a soy producer in Mato Grosso, and also because one of your fact sheets on the EU-Mercosur deal has mentioned that basically only 13% of soy that is imported from Mercosur can be considered as deforestation free. I mean, that seems to be a very low threshold in comparison to the numbers that we've been hearing today. So before I go to Raoni, because we really want to hear about his data that he's been doing on this subject, and also about the project in Pará, the Selo Verde project, which is based more on the beef commodities that are exported. I'd like to turn to Ricardo, who wanted a word as a reaction to Toby.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just would like to add that we are doing already this best management practice inside the farms in some states of Brazil. Mato Grosso state in 2011, in a partnership with Abiove, our national oil industry association, we started a program to visit farms. The name is Soja Plus of that program. And we visit the farms and tell them what to do on the labor safety and environmental issues, because many of them, they don't know perfectly what is the law, what the law says about many of these rules and everything, okay? So we started a program in 2011. AProSoja, the Soybean Farmers Association of Mato Grosso State, I was working there as the president of the Sustainability Commission, yeah. And we started this program bringing information, training, courses, booklets that we made, films about how to be in compliance with many different laws in Brazil related to environment and labor safety. Some years ago, we were noted by FIFEC and FEDIOL, the European Federation of Feed and Oil Seed Industries also. For 2 years, we discussed a program together with FIFEC and FEDIOL. After that, in 2016, we signed a memorandum of understanding where we choose 59 items, a checklist that anyone can go to a farm and check if it's the farmer is in compliance to that. And FIFEC just launched in 2017 the soy benchmarking tool. They have a soy benchmarking that any certification program is able to go there, to get there and say, well, my certification does this and that, and they say, yes, your certification is okay with our principles and criteria for what is sustainable production. We should develop that. In the last 15 years, many things happened here in Brazil. And every time I talk to Europeans, it's the same speech, blaming and blaming and blaming. Maybe it's time for us to tie some partnership about that. Yeah.
So talking about the partnerships, thank you, Ricardo. I wanted to turn to Raoni because I really am interested in this farm level platform that you've done in the state of Pará. Can you perhaps give us a bit more information on that? But before you get into the Selo Verde, I mean, you did write a remarkable piece for Science Magazine on the question of the fact that it is really this, again, these rotten apples, a very small amount of properties which are responsible for the problem. And in fact, when you were looking at the data, you used Toby's trace system and developed what I understand to be a super sophisticated geospatial software that you overlapped with 815,000 rural properties. So, I mean, firstly, how did you do that and what did you find?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. So I think just to explain the differences, the complementarities, Trace's work is really essential to all this because it has been revolutionizing the way we see, especially international trade, because it looks at what happens in a given municipality, which is already a small enough level of analysis, and then know where is being exported to, by which companies, and even which banks fund those companies. So this is really, really important, and actually become a data infrastructure for further work, such as ours, which basically looks, okay, what then happens inside the municipality? Because you might see in a given municipality meat and soy production and deforestation, but not necessarily the farms that are deforesting are the farms that they are producing. So, and also you need to apply the rules of Brazil's forest code, because what's important here is not only deforestation, but also to what extent that's legal or illegal deforestation. Because we're talking about here not only a climate problem, but also a legal problem. When companies for instance, in Europe are buying a product that is illegal in Brazil. And so we developed this software in the last actually 20 years called Dinamica EGO, which is a high performance software that runs in quite powerful computers, then actually analyze the individual maps of each properties, and in order to analyze what are the riparian forests, what are the legal reserves, which are the areas that must be conserved by each farmer, as said by Ricardo, which actually it was imposed in 1965. And then in 2012, you had a big amnesty where about 60% of all illegal deforestation was pardoned, and all deforestation prior to 2008 was actually uplifted, because then you have 20 years to recover that. And the key problem now is really what happens next, what happens after 2008. So we're looking individually at the deforestation in those farms, and to what extent that deforestation was done respecting the boundaries of Brazil's legislation or not. Because this has been a complaint for farmers in Brazil for a long time, that Brazilian own legislation is not taken into account, and we have done that. And so first, what we have found is that actually only 15% of the farmers in the Amazon, so 1/5, have deforested after 2008. Which again, confirms this idea of the rotten apples. But then when you look at the agricultural production, for instance, in soy, we found that about 20% of the volume of soy produced in the Amazon happens in farms with illegal deforestation after 2008. It's important to clarify that a large portion of that does not happen inside the farm, where you deforest and you grow soy in the area that has been deforested. However, what many farmers have been doing is deforesting, then having cattle or other crops that are not soy inside the farm, but we still have illegalities taking place inside the farm, and we believe that must be tackled. And also we have done the same thing for beef, and we have found actually results which are very different from what many of the big companies in Brazil have been saying, which they have zero deforestation linked to the supply chains, and we have found in some states up to 50% of the beef being produced linked directly. So the people that actually selling to the meat packer are deforesting, or indirectly throughout the supply chain. And this raises the importance of actually developing a system which is first government-led, because if in Brazil, as all over the world, governments are the ones responsible to tell consumers if that food is safe or not, why shouldn't governments be also responsible for telling their consumers and their partners if that produce is deforestation free or not? Why should we push that responsibility to others, to companies that might be black boxed, or to NGOs which have limits in terms of data access? And that's why we partnered with the government of Pará and developed with them a governmental system called Selo Verde that provides exactly that. A transparent monitoring system, which also involves soy, so not only beef, that gives information at property level that would then allow, for instance, the EU to do the proper checks of due diligence or other buyers, knowing that they have a robust set of information behind this, and actually you have a government responsible for providing all the necessary information.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive overview. I mean, I think it's very interesting, the fact that it's happening at a state level, really, these commitments in terms of traceability. Fernando, you're in the state of Mato Grosso. We're also getting a number of questions here from our audience in this distinguishing factor between legal and illegal deforestation, right? Your state has made a commitment that, if I understand basically covers both, right? Is that a correct assessment? Could you give us a bit more information on what's happening in Mato Grosso?
Well, if you look at all the deforestation in Mato Grosso, about 90% of it is illegal anyway. So, you know, if you tackle illegality, you are already covering a lot of the deforestation that is coming to the supply chains. But the thing is, we have to address illegal deforestation using, you know, command and control policies. So it's it's the government job to do that, right? And the legal deforestation we have to tackle with incentives. We have, for example, some instruments that are being tested in Mato Grosso, like Conserve, for example, that was launched here and is paying farmers, you know, for the areas that they could legally clear, but they are not clearing because they are receiving this kind of environmental payment to keep those areas. So, yeah, the idea is that Mato Grosso can conserve its environmental assets, tackling illegality, but also creating these incentives to reduce the legal deforestation. And I think it's possible to do both. But Emily,
Anna, if I may just switch to Anna,
yeah,
Fernando, we will come back to you. There are so many questions coming in. Anna, if I just may come back to you before we move into the core topic of EU-Mercosur, but also answer all the questions that are coming in for all of you. We've heard about these sort of the necessity of these control and command policies, the fact that a lot's happening at a state level in Brazil. What can the EU do to really encourage more of these initiatives? And I mean, there'll probably never be enough initiatives, but really, what is in the EU's hands today to really, I would say, reward the states that are doing it right?
I think it is a super tricky question, to be very honest, because I mean, yeah, the big elephant in the room, if you have a government like President Bolsonaro, who is like constantly dismantling every environmental protection on the ground, who is really, for example, probably all of you have seen this new Reuters investigation that all the environmental penalties are basically abolished. And this is, of course, one of the main points in really protecting the Amazon. Several legislations, like, for example, basically legalizing land grabbing, especially in indigenous areas, is about to be voted in the Congress quite soon. I mean, it was already on the agenda several times. So I just want to point out the fact that the problem is really if you have, of course, a central government who is completely working against all these kind of goals that I think all of us here have in common, then it's of course a problem. And what I have been commenting on, looking at the US approach of giving a lot of money or promising a lot of money, is of course, yeah, that it's on the one hand important to support everyone in Brazil, all the stakeholders who want to decrease deforestation and so on and so on. But I think it cannot be that the government is on the one hand dismantling everything and on the other hand then we give Bolsonaro money. So this cannot be. I think what is really important, and I think it's amazing that also Fernando is here today. There is of course different sceneries on state level. And I think at the moment while we still have the Bolsonaro government, it is, I guess, more promising to support people with technical assistance or with probably also financial means, civil society, like on focusing more on state level. I think in general, the EU should also always put political and diplomatic pressure on the central government. I think this is also quite important, to be very honest. And yeah, we come, I guess, to the trade relations later, as you said, but these are some of the ideas. I mean, I'm also very interested actually to hear from the Brazilian representatives here in the call what they think the EU should do. I find this very important because I'm also, as you probably know, vice president of the Brazil delegation in the European Parliament, and we had this topic also a lot on our agenda. And of course, we are also in contact with our Brazilian counterparts, which is quite interesting.
Thank you. So much about that, and talking about, you know, what the Brazilians here today think that the EU should be doing. We'll get to that in a moment. We have a lot of questions coming, but I don't want to lose the opportunity before we open up to the Q&A moment of this session to really talk about the trade and sustainable development chapter of the EU-Mercosur. And I must say, I have to thank Jana for her patience today. It's been an absolute amazing to have you with us. As mentioned, I mean, you are the Parliament's in-house expert on these issues. You recently wrote a study on sustainable development and trade, and particularly the provisions that we find in our trade agreements. We've been hearing quite a lot in that regard, and particularly about the question of whether these provisions are enforceable. So, I mean, how do you see these? Why are these provisions, firstly, why are they included in trade deals? Why do we put them there and not in like the political or the corporation chapters? And are they enforceable? Jana, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, and it was truly amazing to listen to the perspectives also from the Brazilian representatives, and thank you for having me here. Basically, TSD provisions have been included in EU trade agreements pretty much since EU-South Korea, so 2011, they have been systematically included. And there's a few main drivers for this. In one way, historically, sustainable development is part of the multilateral trading system's objectives, is part of the WTO agreement's preamble, and has been a goal of EU trade policy since the Lisbon Treaty. So in part, it's EU values, it's included in EU trade strategies, but specifically to include it in trade agreements, there's also the question of how much trade liberalization ends up affecting negatively biodiversity, climate, even labor issues, and the need to mitigate those negative externalities through built-in provisions inside the trade agreement. And at the same time, for EU businesses, there's the interest of having a more level playing field with regards to labor standards or climate ambitions with partner countries. And for them, the trade agreements can be a moment to have incentive with partner countries to, for example, ratify fundamental conventions, put into force multilateral environmental agreements. And there's a view that partner countries are more likely to do that in advance, during the negotiations, in order to get that duty-free access into a big single market like the EU. And the TSD chapters I mentioned, they're included now quite routinely. The EU-Mercosur agreement also has a TSD chapter. It has issues concerning the right to regulate, transparency, multilateral labor standards, trade and climate change, trade and biodiversity. And also there's an Article 8 on trade and sustainable management of forests, which I would also find interesting to hear what the Brazilian counterparts think and experts think here, because there's provisions recognizing the importance of sustainable forest management. There's the encouragement to trade in products from sustainably managed forests. And as a kind of more novelty, the forest-based local communities and indigenous people should be integrated into sustainable supply chains. So these are kind of these interesting provisions that are inside the TSD chapter, but the main controversy that often arises around sustainable development chapters is whether they are enforceable, as you mentioned, Emily. And they are and they are not. For critics, they demand more enforceability for those provisions because of the following. TSD chapters are carved out from the general dispute settlement mechanism of the trade agreement as a whole. So in general, in trade agreements, if you have a disagreement, you can take it through a process after which you can be mandated to withdraw trade preferences, to put up tariffs again. And this is considered a real stick, like it's often referred to as economic sanctions. And currently also in the EU-Mercosur agreement, this is not foreseen. So there is no sort of possibility to have withdrawal of trade preferences just on the basis of sustainable development violations. But on the other hand, the opposite argument does say that TSD chapters do include dispute settlement provisions. There's a dedicated mechanism that has consultations, it has a panel of experts that issues recommendations, and there's now been a first dispute between EU and South Korea that has gone through this process. And the EU challenged South Korea for labor breaches, and the panel concluded that South Korea was indeed in violation of those breaches. And so all eyes are now on the follow-up of that case. In addition, the big focus will be on how the review of the EU 15-point action plan that in 2018 set out actions to implement and enforce TSD chapters better, how that review will go. So EP's INTA committee will be discussing this with the Commission on Tuesday, and also here us at the EPRS, we're publishing a briefing on the review of the 15-point action plan. So there's a lot happening.
Which will encourage everyone here to read in. A quick question actually already coming into the panelists, but I do want to come back to the sustainable development clauses. For you, Jana, what is the role that the WTO can play in these kinds of issues of tackling deforestation and trade?
So the WTO, of course, applies to most countries of the world who are members of it. And in that sense, you can also argue that WTO's provisions cover to a big extent certain climate or environment violations. And the role WTO agreements play is that through the WTO, a country, for example, the EU as WTO member, could challenge another for problems in the area of sustainable development, because there are specific exceptional clauses in the WTO's agreements which allow trade preferences or to be challenged, withdrawn on the basis of issues like natural resource depletion or due to concerns like protection of animal, human life or health. So there are provisions in place, and there's several cases that have been litigated at the multilateral level that have shown that to an extent it works, but it is very much about how that specific trade measure would be drafted. So it is not super straightforward either.
That's fascinating. I mean, if we can't really get, much progress in the WTO, surely a trade deal would offer sort of a platform in order to achieve more cooperation, or at least more enforceability of a number of these provisions. And then turning to you, Anna, we understand that you're not the EU-Mercosur's biggest fan in the European Parliament, particularly on these particular issues. But my question to you is, if this agreement isn't ratified with Mercosur, doesn't the EU lose environmental influence?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks also to Jana for the perfect explanations of the TSD chapters. First of all, let me explain you one thing and also go back to the WTO question, because I just want to show you how important trade rules are, because you all know the soy tariffs are on zero for a couple of years already. So this is not even in the Mercosur agreement, because this is already the rules. I think it was even before WTO, it was one of the previous rounds. And of course, with that, the export of soy exploded. And with that also the expansion of soy production in Brazil exploded. So it is just very, very important that trade rules have a very concrete impact on production, on exports, and thus also an environmental degradation, just to make this very clear. And this also brings me now to the Mercosur agreement. It's always nice to have influence in theory, but of course, if already the DNA of the trade agreement is wrong, then of course, the benefits of probably mitigating that might be too small. And this is how I evaluate personally the agreement, because the agreement will lead to more exports of agricultural products, and that will basically have a negative impact on the situation, for example, in the Amazon region, but also in other biospheres in the region, especially when there is not enough environmental protection and national legislation in place, which I just explained before. And then on the other hand, you don't have properly enforceable TSD chapters. You don't have mechanisms in place that can really mitigate this. All of that taken together, I come to a negative evaluation that I think just having Brazil not leaving the Paris Agreement, because this is often the biggest achievement that is being sold. Yeah, okay, on paper it's true, but it doesn't really change the reality, and we don't have no influence on the reality. So this is basically one big criticism that I have. And just as a matter of fact, because sometimes it is also being seen as only bringing benefits to everyone. But if you look a little bit at the structure of the Mercosur agreement, yeah, it will basically increase the raw material exports from countries like Brazil, and it will increase the industrial goods increases from the European Union. So a little bit these old trade flows that we have seen for decades, and might even also hamper some of the industrial production in countries like Brazil or Argentina. There's, for example, a study that shows there might be a job loss of 200,000 jobs in Argentina because, of course, the competition, European companies are highly competitive. So it's also the whole picture that we have to address. There is other points of criticisms that I have, for example, the precautionary principle.
We will address the industrial aspect in further debates here at ECIPE as part of this project. But if I can just stay on the point of agriculture, if I may, Raoni, Ricardo, this debate here that we're hearing that an increase of the market access to Europe has a sort of a de facto, and from what I'm hearing, it isn't that clear, effect on deforestation is something that, I mean, clearly is slightly more complex than what we've been hearing in Europe. And I'd like to turn to you on a couple of these. Firstly, Raoni, I mean, can you put these numbers into perspective, right? Because, for instance, there was a study that was commissioned by the French government recently that said that the beef quota, and of course it's a sector that you understand well, as does Fernando, that this beef quota of 99,000 tons afforded to Mercosur under the trade deal would lead to an additional 25% of deforestation in Brazil. And for anyone that knows, I mean, the size of that production and exports of Mercosur, it seemed to be quite an exaggeration. But I'd really like your sort of more, I would say, scientific evaluation of that before we turn to Ricardo on soy.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Yeah, I think it's important to be careful with numbers, and our effort here at UFMG, the Federal University of Minas Gerais, has always been to look at to the conservative measures based on property level analysis, and it seemed to me that those numbers don't really work so well, especially because the quota, the beef quota to the EU would imply, if it's additional and not only the reduction of taxes on a beef that's already exported to the EU, would amount to an increase of production in Brazil of 1% of what's being produced right now. So something that impacts 1% in the increase of the production that leads to a third in increase of deforestation seems not to make a lot of sense. Of course, it's necessary to take closer looks, and I had access to the report very recently, and on top of that, it's in French, and so of course I had to to also look more in detail. But it's necessary to have an idea. But also, so what I see here is that considering also that soy is already tax-free in terms of export, so the Mercosur agreement doesn't touch soy, it's going to touch beef. We have, of course, here a risky situation that would be to sign to Brazil's farmers that even if deforestation is rampant, the EU is willing to buy more from Brazil. That's a negative message. We don't want to do that. However, at the same time, given the links that already exist and given the changes that might be made in relation to the new agreement, if you compare what's already in place, I believe it's much better to have an agreement that pushes Brazil in the right direction and formalizes a commercial agreement such as the soy moratoria, which is an agreement done by companies. There is nothing official about that, and could be changed tomorrow. If that's actually implemented in the terms of the agreement, we might have something much more robust on the long term in terms of results, but also in terms of transparency and traceability, which I think it's essential to all this. because we have found that even the EU traces system, trade expert system, not to make confusion with the trace system from Toby at all, is actually allowing, when you look at the farms that are already being allowed by the EU to export, most of them either buy their cows from other farms with deforestation or deforest themselves, because it's only controlling for sanitary issues right now, not deforestation issues. So there is certainly a big role for the EU to put its act together, improve its own system, and actually demand more transparency and better ways for traceability for its commercial partners.
So perhaps more of a demand-based approach then, Haoni. Ricardo, going now into the questions, we have a question for you, which is AproSoja supportive of the Amazon soy moratorium?
No. And that's very easy to understand, because since the beginning, the soy moratorium is against legal deforestation. So how can an association be against somebody that is obeying the law? One of the toughest law in the world, the environmental laws that Brazil have. So if we try to negotiate that they put the word illegal deforestation on the moratorium, and we are in, because being against the soy moratorium does not mean that we are supportive for illegal deforestation, but not legal. It's in the law. And the law is tough. So we have to support the legislation in Brazil. That's what we do. But I would like to say, may I? About what Representative Anna said about Bolsonaro. That's not about just one government. I am waiting as a farmer in the last 20 years to see the deforestation stop in Brazil. And some other governments from the left, from the center, from the right, they had all the support to do that here in Brazil, and they didn't succeed. It's a shame. So what can we really do? Another aspect, it's very clear that the deforestation is not related to the increase of the demand, okay? The demand is not a driver for the deforestation here in Brazil. There is another issues on there. It's complicated, but it's not the demand, the single driver.
So if we look
one last sentence. So when you try to punish a farmer, a soybean farmer that is trying to obey the law because somebody is illegally deforesting the Amazon, this is very bad. You know, this is not good for the market. Okay, if you talk to any farmer here in Brazil, they think that these issues that come, environmental issues that comes from Europe, it's a non-tariff barrier for trading. That's it. That's what we think about that. Unfortunately, I know it's much more than that, yeah, but the general opinion here is that it's not a non-tariff barrier, and this is not good for anybody. Yeah? We have to tie partnerships and not just blame each other. That's the way we are going to move up with these sustainability issues. Thank you.
So a robust view there from Mato Grosso, Ricardo. I'd like to turn to Toby and Fernando. We've got some really great questions coming in here, and particularly the question of carbon credits that could work on the supply side, also to, let's say, to diminish the legal deforestation that we've been talking about right now. Fernando, you, I know that you've been tackling this question of legal deforestation. We've already mentioned that. Is there a role for credits, and how are the financing mechanisms, how can they be better exploited in this situation? And then over to Toby with the same question.
Hi, Emily. Yeah, absolutely. I see carbon as the game changer for the situation that we are living today in Brazil. First of all, if you look at trade and agriculture, I think the market is the biggest pusher of efficiency in agriculture in Brazil. You know, Brazil improved a lot in productivity and efficiency, and we are able to produce more using less because Brazil was inserted in the global market for soy, for beef, and other commodities. So I think this is very important to understand. And the second thing that I would like to say is that up to now, all the policies on the private side, but also on the public side, that are aiming to, decouple deforestation from supply chain, they are all based on exclusion. So it's moratorium, embargoes. If the guys has deforestation, I'm not buying. If they don't have the documents, I'm not buying. So I think there's a big risk there, especially on the private side, is that these big multinational companies with all these commitments, they are going to create a small group of producers that can be able to supply all their volume and fit all the criteria that they need. So what we are creating is a kind of rural apartheid, where you have, a small part of producers producing all the volume and fitting all the criteria that the marketing needs, and you have all the rest living on the landscape. And it's not going to solve, exclusion is not going to solve the problem of deforestation on the landscape. We have to work on ways to incentivize and include these people. And I think carbon is the best tool that we have. If we can link carbon and trade, this is the best tool that we have to transform the landscape. So carbon is the way that we can incentivize as farmers, as Ricardo, that are applying good practices on his farm, protecting the environment. We can incentivize regions that are making progress reducing deforestation. And we have cooperation agreements with European countries that go on that sense. Let's map the risk and let's cooperate to act on the risk and together with companies and the public sector to reduce the risk on those producing regions. We have now Germany paying Mato Grosso for the reduction of deforestation that we had in the last decades, in the last past years. It's called the Red Early Movers Program, and that money is being used to invest in controlling deforestation, supporting smallholders, supporting good practices on the field and indigenous people. So I think that's the kind of cooperation that Ricardo was talking about. And I think if we are able to make the link between trade and carbon and making this flow of money going to the right places, monitor progress and making sure that the more progress you have, more incentive you have, then we can transform these producing landscapes.
Toby, carbon, is it the solution?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I mean, I support a lot of what Fernando was saying there. I think it's dangerous, though, to place too much hope simply on carbon. One thing that's critical in what Fernando said is that there is a desperate need for carrots to help support and reward good progress. There's no question. But what won't work is a delivery compensation mechanism at scale that tries to pay individual farmers for not deforesting. The transaction costs involved in that, delivering it at scale and over the long term and expanding it to multiple commodities, are astronomical. So reward schemes and incentive schemes to reward and recognize good practice need to be at a higher level. So the kind of jurisdictional approaches that Fernando is leading, I think, are absolutely instrumental. And we need to go beyond window dressing projects in specific places and try and unlock investment to help change some of the structural variables that allow entire regions to shift, which is partly about some technological aspects to do with registration, to do with mapping. It's partly about extension services. It's partly about adding value to products. One of the great ironies of Brazil's incredible agricultural boom is that so much primary product is exported with very little value added before it is exported. If you compare to neighboring Argentina, for example, who export much more in the way of processed oil, soy products at a higher value. So I think that's critical, but we mustn't lose sight as well of if we talk about EU due diligence legislation, which in many ways presents itself as a stick, it can, if done well with the right kind of policy mix, also provide carrots, because it can level the playing field and it can turn supply chains into potentially being a force for good. Now, if there's a requirement from all retailers, let's say, that sell soy products into supermarkets, and of course mostly that's meat products fed by soy, have price taken out of competition with sustainability at a minimum level, they will be able and they'll be supported and encouraged, but they won't be outcompeted to push up the price. of a litre of milk, for example, if you added 2 cents onto a litre of milk across the European Union, that alone could transform the reward and the signal, the market signal for sustainable producers. So there's not going to be a quick price premium, but cutting out the actors who are not conforming to minimum standards, and having a way of ensuring it's not just about price, it's also about market access, about preferential treatment, long-term partnerships between regions, and ideally between whole blocks, can eventually lead to a good amount of change. But we must be cautious about very high transaction costs of very detailed schemes that are only operating in very small places.
Well, I mean, when we're talking about adding the value in Brazil and the price premium that can happen in the EU, I think there are some really good points there. Jana, if I may come back to your trade expertise here, is there a way of putting in carbon incentives into a TSD chapter? I mean, has that ever happened, or how is this question of the climate included, and can we go further?
Well, I was just thinking as we were talking about that, how it would work in practice, and that would be a whole topic for a PhD, I'm sure. But what is now happening is, of course, there's the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal coming out. And there is that same idea of applying to some sectors, not the ones we're quite discussing today, but to some sectors applying a mechanism that will adjust based on the carbon pricing of the partner country. So I see it more taking place in complementary measures. I see it more taking place in EU legislation that will incentivize, there will be a ripple effect, than becoming part and parcel of a trade agreement instantly. And I think private sector initiatives play a huge role on it, compensation initiatives. This is maybe going to be spearheaded by the private sector initially, at least.
I see Raoni nodding there. Would you like to pitch in on the question of how carbon could also be part of this solution? And then to Anna for closing remarks.
I think what's important here is to understand what is the basis of a solution and what is the complement of that solution. If you look at the profile of who's deforesting illegally in soy farms and exporting to the EU, and this actually, it's 90% of the deforestation in soy farms is already done without respecting the legislation. So without tackling that, we can add as much efforts in order to give a premium for farmers that protect extra areas, et cetera, that are not solving the chunk of the problem anyway. But of course, you know, if you simply go there and say, well, I'm doing command and control, and if you are doing, if you are one of these a minority of farmers that actually go beyond your requirements, and there is nothing for you there, that's also unfair. So I think it's important also to think about those other solutions. But I wouldn't put all my eggs in the carbon trade mechanism, because if the basis, which is law enforcement, and the base of law enforcement, the transparency is well set. Because we know the problem, as you know, as already said by Fernando, by Toby, by many others, the key problem here in Brazil right now is the high level of illegality and the high level of illegal deforestation. In relation to that, it's very important to say, well, while it's true that command and control has not zero deforestation, it has reduced by 80% deforestation. That's a lot. And since then, deforestation has tripled. Since 2012, after when you give a big amnesty to people that have deforested prior to 2008, with the change of the new law, you have dismantled the environmental police force called the IBAMA during this whole process, and especially after 2018, not only you have dismantled, but actually you made their work much harder. Now, you know, basically you can find someone deforesting legally, and you issue a fine. That fine is void before you end up having a meeting with that farmer, and now the government is not able to arrange those meetings because of COVID, because they doesn't have enough personnel. So basically, all the fines issued in the last 2 years are void. And of course, this is a huge incentive to do further illegal deforestation. So if you don't solve those problems, then adding these other levels certainly not going to do much.
So it's really about a mix between the enforcement and the incentives, if I'm hearing from all of you, to put it into a very simplest, in simplest terms. Anna, final words?
Yeah, thank you. Also, to quickly comment on that, I just want to underline what was just said with the illegality and the legality, because you had discussed it throughout the webinar, but I also wanted to enforce or reinforce this argument that, of course, when you have a government that legalizes everything, then you have a problem. I just talked to a Brazilian journalist last week, for example, on the timber regulation, and I think the Bolsonaro government is just now legalizing one other tropical forest, and then you can legally import it in the EU. But of course, it's still not a good thing to do. And it's just the question, what is legal and what is illegal? And I think this is not very, very easy to answer. On one word on the demand question that Ricardo said, of course, there could be a way, and also Fernando talked about it, to basically intensify the export without cutting more forest, but it's not being done at the moment. And then we go back again to the legislation that is not in place. So there we also have a little bit a hen and egg problem. But I would say at the moment, increasing demand increases also the destruction in the rainforest. And very quickly on the carbon question, what we Greens are suggesting for improving the Mercosur agreement, because we have already some very specific ideas on how we could improve the deal, is, for example, exactly this tariff differentiation, meaning that more environmental harmful products should have higher tariffs and the other way around. It's very interesting to look, for example, at the Swiss-Indonesia trade agreement. There, this was implemented, I think, for the first time, that basically not sustainable palm oil has much higher tariffs than basically, or cannot be imported, I forgot, than sustainable palm oil. And of course, then you again have the question, what is sustainable palm oil? Does it really exist? But nevertheless, there is a trade mechanism that differentiates between how sustainable or harmful a product is. And then we have other ideas like putting a climate carve out in the agreement, stopping also exports of pesticides that are forbidden in the European Union, because this is another problem. We export so many pesticides to Brazil that is harming the environment there, harming the people. People are dying from that who work on the fields. And the pesticides land also on our plates again in Europe, because they're being imported in residues in, for example, food or whatever. And then, of course, we want enforceable DST chapters. And this is nothing super crazy. We just had concluded a trade agreement with the UK, as you know, and there we have these rebalancing mechanisms that if the UK, whatever, lowers the environmental standards, then we can re-invoke some tariffs or pull away some tariffs. And this could be an interesting mechanism also for the Mercosur agreement.
Well, I'm sure that the question of conditionality of preferential access, which is a sort of a hot topic internationally, is certainly perhaps a great idea for another debate at ECIPE. I wanted to thank you all for participating in this debate, everyone online, as well as our exceptional speakers today. And I also wanted to give a big obrigada to the team at ECIPE who has made today happen. A big round of applause to them. And I will see you soon after the European summer break for a new debate on EU-Mercosur trade relations.